Good morning or good afternoon to everyone who's joining us today, no matter your time zone. I'm Dee Blom, SVP of Marketing here at Anteriad, and I'm so glad that you could make it for our session today. Out of the wild, into the pipeline, we'll be talking about RTIC and their phenomenal B2B growth. So a few housekeeping issues before we jump in. We will be sharing a recording of the session, probably watching it now. And if you have any questions, we're going to hold them until the end, and then we're going to let our panelists cover them at that time. So without any further ado, I'd like to introduce our speakers for today. You are being hosted today by Brent Wiltz, General Manager of RTIC Outdoors, their custom shop, and also Scott Tinkoff, SVP of Client Strategy at Anteriad. Welcome, gentlemen. I allow you a moment to introduce yourselves.
Thanks a lot, Dee. Oh, here we go, Scott. We're jumping in at the same time. Both very eager. I'll go ahead and start it off. Dee, Scott, appreciate the opportunity of sharing, the RTIC story alongside with you guys. Brent Wiltz, GM of the custom shop, spent about 20 years in sales and operations, across a couple different platforms, from startups to multi-billion-dollar international organizations, and excited to share, the growth story, that we have gone through over the past 12 months.
Thanks, Brent, and thanks everybody for being here. And Brent, thanks for sharing this story with us. I'm Scott Tinkoff. I lead our audience identification and strategy team here at Anteriad. I've had the good fortune of partnering very closely with many of you watching this, and with Brent specifically on this story that we're going to share with you today, and look forward to walking through it.
All right, I'm going to go off camera and let you guys go for it.
Wonderful. Brent, can you share a little bit about RTIC, who you are, where you've been, where you're going?
I would absolutely love to. To put simply, RTIC is one of the fastest growing direct-to-consumer outdoor lifestyle brands, period. We're most notably known for tumblers and coolers, but outdoor gear in general. We started off as the D2C and have migrated into, other channels, which is what was the catalyst to working with and partnering with Anteriad.
Yeah, to that end, can you walk us through a little bit of that channel migration and kind of how you've built the business?
Absolutely, Scott, because this is where it starts to get fun. So if you're looking at the slide, start from the bottom all the way up, and I'm going to take you through this progression. As we just mentioned, we started off with that, direct to consumer, and there's one distinction there that I'd like to point out, because if you go to our website, you can customize a product, and those are typically one-offs, personalization. So logo, personalization, or one of the two. We also have a B2B offering, which is our custom shop. Very different. Okay, that's a new channel for us, or not necessarily a new channel, but we moved into a new channel within customization. Very different because this is corporate buying, and there's minimum quantities there. So this is not on the website. It is corporations that are, coming to us directly through a couple of different channels. And then we migrated into online. So think of Amazon. You can purchase RTIC products direct online through Amazon. And then the exciting part is also retail. And we moved into roughly about 8,000 locations across the United States over the past several years. So multiple channels. The takeaway is, unlike most businesses, there's a dominant channel. For RTIC, all of our channels are relatively equal. So they're all important, for the overall growth of RTIC. And the discussion today is centered around our B2B custom shop channel and how we wanted to strategically, grow that over the course of 12 months.
So, Brent, why did you come to us? It feels like you had it all kind of figured out already.
There was a lot we didn't have figured out, Scott. The one thing that we did know is that we had plateaued. And the reason that the custom shop had plateaued is because the business was growing from our D2C, and phenomenal, I would say, problem, to have, right, when you plateau, is the business was coming from people that were already familiar with RTIC, going to the website and then seeing, oh, you do customization as well. Okay, great. The business was growing, and that's the, I think, distinction that I'd like to make. Great business, growing well, doing good things, but it reached a point where we could no longer forecast, predict, how people were coming to custom shop. So we wanted to get a different layer of specific intent around how people, were actually becoming familiar, with RTIC and our custom shop. So what we needed to do was break apart our, D2C and B2B platforms. We weren't going to stop doing what we were already doing, but behind the scenes, we needed to look at how do we want to position the B2B business? And I think we need to do that a little bit differently than we were, from a direct to consumer perspective. And along the way, we wanted to go through all these different changes and spend less. So our marketing spend, was dropping, and we wanted to really focus on what are the key areas that move the business. So I think, like everybody else, we wanted more and wanted to spend less. And that's ultimately, what drove us to Scott and team.
Well, to your point, you're not alone, right? More and more prospecting has always been a challenge, but it's harder than ever, especially in B2B. And some of that is just from inefficiencies in abilities to allocate, right? We have so many more opportunities to market, so many different channels, so many different ways to reach out to businesses, to consumers, to the people in our pipeline, that it's hard to know where to spend that dollar. And that leads to fragmented marketing, right? We're putting a lot of things out there into the world that may not be telling the same message, may not be aligning across those channels. And we certainly may not be talking to the same audience. And so we think we're using these things together in concert and amplifying our message. But in many cases, we're actually just distracting from the overall message. And so more and more people are spending time, I think, trying to identify that B2B audience. And I think that's really what brought us together, was a shared understanding of your brand, your customer, who we were trying to drive, and how we were going to go get them, so that we could stop that slowing return. Because yeah, sometimes we want to pull back on marketing spend, but a lot of the time we've got a marketing budget. How do we spend it more efficiently? How do we change the return that's slowed down? And that slowing return has been prevalent for just about everybody. I said B2B acquisition is always hard, but it's been harder since probably about August or September of 2024 for everybody in the space. And I talked to literally hundreds of companies, and the story is almost identical everywhere. Somewhere in August or September of 24, prospecting became harder. It doesn't necessarily mean prospecting was impossible. It meant you were either spending more to get those same customers, or you were getting fewer new customers. And at first we attributed that to the election. There's always a slowdown in advance of an election. But that wasn't it, right? That wasn't the only piece. And we look back to May of that year, and Google introduced AI overview. And then we move into beyond the election, and we wind up with uncertainty and some geopolitical things that create some issues. But we also have that AI movement happening, right? And Google starts updating their algorithms. They start making an emphasis around organic search being driven by content. And that hurts a lot of folks who look like RTIC, who look like many of the people that I work with day to day, right? We're selling widgets and sprockets. We're not a powerful content site. These large language models are not necessarily what we were designed for. And so when you couple that with tariffs and some of the macro events, it's easy to blame macro, but it's also these micro events in our industry. We start to see this slowdown, and Google continues to make changes into 2025, right? They update to further push towards those content-rich sites. They make AI part of all of the searches later in 25 and into the commercial queries. And so Google, as a channel for most folks, became more expensive and was producing less. Organic search became harder to drive. And so we all need something that helps us drive folks to our site outside of Google, be proactive in bringing people in. We can't just rely on them coming to us. And I think that's the challenge most marketers are facing, is how do we keep people engaged with our brand? How do we bring them in? And how do we make that an engine that's going to continue to drive our business? And that's really what we tried to do with you, Brent. I think that was kind of the crux of it, right? How do we start to build that?
Yeah, absolutely. And, to further your point, we started seeing those things that are outside of our control in our D2C platform and in retail. And the emphasis turned to B2B, because regardless of what is happening outside of our control, we can always focus on a net new customer within the B2B segment, which is why it became, a priority. We need to get this right. We need to understand. And these are the things that we need to be looking at. And it started off with, how do we look at the mix of customers? We want to break out net new demand, net new customers, and then how we're feeding the current customers that we already have. In other words, we needed to diversify the profile of our customer. Not that we wanted better or different customers. We just needed to look at that in different ways, because we have enterprise, distributors, small organizations, large organizations, all buy at different times for different reasons at different scale. So we needed to really understand that and match that, throughout the year in order to expedite, the ability to grow in certain areas. To your point around marketing, I joke and say I want everyone's, dream of spending less and getting more, right? But at the end of the day, when we truly understand the data and the results and how to apply that, we're more than happy to spend more. So we've been extremely transparent around, this is what we plan to spend. This is how we need to do that. And we're going to ebb and flow, as we learn things along the way. So understanding what we have the ability to spend was extremely important. And then we wanted to look at tests. So we wanted to do things in phases. It started off with a couple of months, and then it trickled into 6 months. And we wanted, a 3 and 6 month data set to truly understand, are we doing the right things? Are we on the right path? And can we scale from understanding where we're winning? And we wanted to apply that into months that were traditionally slower for us. Not slow months, but just the way that our business works, those have been traditionally slower. Unlike traditional brands that may have peaks and valleys, okay, like our D2C has peaks and valleys depending upon the holiday or Mother's Day or Valentine's Day, things like that. And the custom shop is very different. We are consistently growing over the year. And then in December, it takes a little bit of a drop. So January, February, March are typically slower months, but that's because we're having to catch up from a really busy time. We wanted to see if we could drive revenue in those months by the partnership, with Scott and team. And that is one of the things that we were able to do, because we spent 6 months understanding what we want to do in those January and February and March timeframes.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point, Brent. You guys set a pretty clear KPI for us, right? Drive new customers, help us do that throughout the year, not just in the good times, but in the slow times too. And also, you mentioned not just wanting to cut spend, wanting to find the right way to allocate that spend and grow that spend. And even the scaling that we did in Q3 and Q4 of last year, we didn't honestly expect that initially. I don't think anybody was entirely thinking we would get there, but the results drove it. We made the pivots quickly and we were able to get there. And that's really, I think, the whole goal of what we tried to put together, right? Let's use a couple of channels in concert around an audience. Let's use email and programmatic built around an audience with a consolidated message. Let's tie them together with intelligence and analytics. Let's be smart on how we build that audience. Let's be even smarter on how we read the results of that audience so that we can truly understand incrementality and the impact of our program. And the hope is we drive acceleration of your marketing dollar, acceleration of your growth, acceleration of really the brand and customer knowledge of the brand. And I think that was really together what we were able to do is bounce ideas off of each other, see the progress, see the things that were working, and start to build that over the 6 months. To that end, we really moved forward with our plan of bringing those pieces together. We call it Growth Accelerator, right? The pairing of email and programmatic with that intelligence to get it going. But we built it with you really around 5 basic pillars, right? Started with the audience, ended with our ability to scale. And can you talk a little bit about that, Brent, on how each of these pillars kind of came together and how they made the greater whole better?
Absolutely. And this is where it starts to get fun. I think each one of these 5 could probably be a 30-minute webinar all into itself, the level of, detail that we went into each one. But from an operator's perspective, going through this, the targeting for us, it was relying on you guys to create the correct audience. And that was a driver for us. We had an idea of what our audience was. We tracked those things, but we weren't really sure. So we relied on the relationship and your expertise, at that stage, to really drive the right audience. The engagement and measurement became the core around everything that we were doing. And we were doing these in tandem. So from an engagement perspective, that is email, display, and programmatic. And not one at certain times. This was a combination of everything. And we then needed to understand and measure, the effectiveness, of every single one of those particular categories. And that's where it started to get interesting. We spent an enormous amount of time looking at data around open rates, click rates, what drove those? Those were more important, than just an open rate. Was it subject lines? Was it the content? Was it the fact that we moved from traditional B2B, promotional to, we moved from traditional D2C promotional to B2B. There's a lot of different changes, came into play as a result of us starting to measure how things were developing. And then once we had an idea of what was winning in that strategy, we started to go deeper. So for the first time, we started segmenting, our customers, or in some cases verticals, right? And then we started, how are these people buying? So we aligned those segments with use cases that then changed, how we were messaging. We started then opening up different categories, different channels, and then that moved over to how we were addressing our current customers. So this went beyond the accelerator program, because we were spending so much time on how we're engaging, how we're measuring, what's winning, and where do we want to try that somewhere else. The part that is equally as important, and I think we should underscore, is as much as I tend to talk about the things that we changed and the things that we learned, it is the things that we didn't change, I think, that are most important, or at least equally as important, because there's a lot of restraint in this is working, let's not touch that. So Scott and team really pushed on these things are working really well, but let's continue to, A/B test on some other areas that might add more value, for us to optimize different things or look at things from a different perspective when we actually want to scale. And as we evolved, over the course of, 6 to 8 months, where we stand today is very different from where we started, back in July. We were basically trying to target people when they were ready to buy. That was the game. Today, although we're not going to stop doing that because it works, we want to put people through a journey. We want to create a raving fan. I don't care from an RTIC perspective if you're ready to buy today or a year from now, but I do want you to think about RTIC, when you have the need for a cooler or some drinkware, right? So we want to put people through a different buyer's journey. And that's what we're starting to do now.
Yeah, and I think that's the exciting part for us too, is that it can often be a challenge for folks to start there, right? If you start with, we're going to start branding and warming people, and they're going to buy in a year. That's a really difficult sell, whether it's to the executive team or the board or whomever you're trying to explain that to, right?
Yeah.
Trust us, this will work.
Right.
But once we were able to build an engine that was driving sales, driving quotes today, now you can start to build for the future as well. And there's a lot more faith in that coming through, right? I think the other thing is there's a through line to all of this. And Brent talked about consistency. And the one consistent piece was audience and data. And while we've expanded the audience, contracted the audience, shifted the audience has stayed the core of a lot of this, right? The data behind it, hitting the right people at the right time, and identifying the right segments that matter. Construction being a big one, manufacturing being a big one. Keeping those audiences part of the program, getting better about the right people to target, the signals that make them the right people to target today. That's really been the consistent part of all of this, whether we were just starting out on the pilot, scaling, or moving into the program in 2026. So let's talk a little bit about results, right? Brent, where were you guys at after 30, 60 days?
Yeah. So numbers always tell the story, right? Here's where we were when we first saw these numbers, Scott. And I feel comfortable saying this. We didn't believe the numbers after 60 days.
Neither did we.
Right? They're positive. These were, really good numbers, over a very short period of time. And it was a testament to the right audience was being targeted. And I think June and July, from a timing perspective, were great months, for us to launch, this particular campaign. So great numbers, great out of the gate success. But we saw the success because it wasn't one thing. We combined email, display, programmatic, and various tests in that time frame to get very aggressive to see what could we learn in a very short period of time so that we could scale over the next 6 months going into our busiest season.
Yeah. And I think, being able to not focus, and this is another one of those things where you trusted us and were willing to keep it simple. Instead of trying to parse everything out and say, hey, what exactly is this channel doing versus this channel, or this timing versus this, or this creative against another one. We were testing all those things. We were tracking all those things. We wanted to know what those things looked like. But the KPI, we stuck to it, right? It was drive more new customers, drive it with a combination of channels. And what we saw right away was the multi-channel efforts were outpacing the single channel efforts. So let's keep at it. Let's see where we can take it.
Exactly. And just to reiterate, we tried to make it very simple and say our metric is net new customers coming into the business. That is how we're going to measure things. There's going to be a lot of other noise and a lot of other people coming into RTIC from a buying perspective, but net new is how we were going to measure things. And I think this slide here represents that very well from my perspective. And I know you'll elaborate a lot more on this, Scott, but the biggest takeaway from the 5 stages is that every one of these stages needed to happen at the same time. And that was our biggest takeaway as things were being recommended and outlined. It was, if we're not understanding the correct audience, how are we going to engage with them? And if we don't have the correct understanding of how we're going to engage, how do we measure that? And if we're not, engaging and measuring, how can we possibly optimize and scale, right? So every step was equally as important, and we were able to cascade faster than what we thought because we were trying to do this all at the same time. Now, that created a lot of noise, a lot of work, or a lot of interpretation. But when we step back and look at things from, just how do we simplify like the complexity, it's looking at net new revenue. What is driving that? What is winning, from an open rate? How are we going to take this to another channel? And if we take it to another channel, does that create another way for people, to actually become familiar with RTIC? So all of these coming together at the same time became our unique driver throughout the partnership.
And you're right, it's a lot to manage on both ends, right? Where we're consistently tweaking and changing and learning and evolving. But that's also what makes it exciting. That's what also makes it successful. And sticking with that baseline of the audience and orchestrating the channels together, having that one clear KPI, and then really, I think having that rigorous testing methodology, right? Saying, and you guys did a great job kind of holding our feet to the fire initially and continuing to do that all the way through. We need to test this. We need to prove this. We need to show this. Help us build a holdout panel that is accessible and understandable and easily understood, that we can hold and be consistent. And so we can show incrementality. We don't just want to say, hey, there's a bunch of sales coming from these folks. We want to know what the incremental impact is. And that, I think, was a great shared understanding between the companies.
Agreed.
And to that end, we did exactly that at the end of the 6-month pilot.
We absolutely did. A couple key numbers here to look at and really unpack. So net new revenue was just under 3 million. ROAS pretty close to 7 when you look at it. The biggest takeaway from my perspective from the performance that we had over 6 months was ultimately how it affected the overall business. And that was an 11% increase, year over year. So when you think about driving net new business, to a growing B2B engine, 11% is a significant jump. And we were able to do this, in the ways that we've discussed, but it was ultimately how we were measuring net new, how we were measuring the conversion, of customers that were going to our website. So when we looked at the success, we are looking at how we actually drove new customers, a mix of customers throughout the business that made up for maybe a large customer in a given month, that may have been in the prior year. So the diversification of customers coming into the business was 11% lift. Very successful when we look at 6 months.
And you weren't growing at 11% the first half of the year, were you?
No.
Yeah. So, really being able to drive that. And it was, the proof was in the pudding too, as we watched that incremental ROAS creep up the second half of the year. It continued to grow as the months went on. And some of that we thought, well, these are the high times of the season, right? Like this is best purchase time. Of course, we're seeing that incrementality grow, but that's continued into 2026 into slow months.
Yeah.
Maybe altered our spend a little bit, altered our targeting a little bit, but the incrementality has continued because some of those orders that we didn't think would carry over from Q4 did carry over into Q1. And that incrementality, you said 7, that's because it is at 7 or above now. So we continue to see that.
Yeah. And that was the biggest takeaway that we had from the program. We thought we would be hitting people at the right time in that particular month and didn't realize how much that pipeline could actually grow, over the course of the second month or the third month or even the fourth. We're starting to see month 4 and month 5 pick up as well.
So Brent, from your perspective, what are a few key takeaways you'd want everybody to have from here?
Yeah, I think the diversification of the customers coming into the business, that's number one. The biggest thing I feel we achieved through this program is the areas of the business that we affected outside of the program. And, that might sound, a little silly, but, because of the challenge back and forth that we had with you and team, Scott, we were able to open up new channels. So we opened up YouTube, TikTok. We moved into Instagram. We moved into different ways of targeting our current customers. We looked at different ways from an SEO and GEO perspective. We had to change our production. So now we're talking operations, as a result of the orders coming in. So orders coming in and orders going out, we had to look at that as well. So there were additional areas of custom shop that we had to address as a result of the growth. And that's the true lift of the relationship. The areas that we haven't really talked about today, and how we were able to leverage what was winning in the outreach and the level of engagement across areas that we weren't thinking about. But because we were going down this path, it made logical sense to then start to overlap and create that ecosystem. And that's what I was talking about when we were discussing the 5 stages. And when you get to scale, it was no longer, let's send out some campaigns. We are so far from that initial thought process to now we're creating an entire ecosystem so that if someone sees RTIC Custom Shop, they're going to see the same thing, feel that same experience, regardless of what platform or what way they're entering, the custom shop experience.
Yeah, and I think it really is important as we continue to evolve as marketers, and we see this with you all, we see this across the board. It's kind of breaking the shackles of the campaign world, right? We get so focused on a specific campaign or a specific effort. It's really about growing the brand. It's really about growing the sales. It's really about forcing you to change your production schedule and bring more people in and walk me through the warehouse at the end of the year and go, yeah, these people weren't here last month.
Right.
That's exciting, right? That's what we're here to do. That's what we're trying to build. And I think, really you kind of hit on this and speak to it, right? But and maybe this is our opportunity to bring this back as another conversation here down the road, because I really would like to hear about all the things that you all have already moved into, but now where are you going and what are the next steps that we're taking?
Yeah. We, from an audience standpoint, we have not reached it. We're not tapped out, as you obviously know. So there's the current, which will stay going, but the fun stuff is moving into the things that we don't yet know. We're experimenting with YouTube. TikTok is very different. So social is a big area for us, not to necessarily move to social, but what are we learning and how are people engaging and how do we then incorporate that into campaigns? I mean, we just sent out our first one that included a video. So we've had a lot of success early on in that area, but it's more focused around how are people gravitating towards that. So social media is a big one. How we're retaining current customers is a big one. But just how we're incorporating that into the overall, messaging is the bigger takeaway. And I would love to start to unpack that, in a different conversation, because we've had a lot of fun. Never would have thought I'd be spending my nights creating videos, but we're learning so much from it. Like, how can we not? Yeah. So fun times ahead.
Yeah, I'll take you up on that. There's more conversations to come, but it's exciting to see that, success here can lead to success elsewhere. We can take those learnings, bring them elsewhere. There's so much of this, right? Everybody's always talking about what is happening today, and what I need to do to keep up with the times. And a lot of it is go back to what worked historically in some ways, right? Channels change, the speed at which things happen changes, but the tactics and the base strategies don't change all that much. And so that's the cool part, is that what we're learning today is transferable to the future.
Exactly. Simplify the complexity.
Well, shameless plug while we've got everybody. And Brent, thank you so much for doing this. Thanks everybody for tuning in and being a part of this. But we're going to continue this conversation, and hopefully Brent will help continue this conversation in Milwaukee in September and October, straddling those 2 months at the St. Kate. Should be a great time to bring together a bunch of folks in the industry to share their stories, not only hear from Brent, but hear from others and share your story alongside of it. So hope many of you can attend that as well.
And we have a lot of questions from our participants, if we can give them a couple of minutes. So from Mr. Nelson, he has a two-part question. When did you begin selling through promotional products distribution? And then he followed up with how much of that 11% growth came from those distributors.
We started in the promo and distribution line of business years ago. So we've been in that for the past several years. It's been a growing channel of ours. We've been doing a couple of things as a result of the partnership. It represents a smaller portion of that 11%. It's closer to 3 to 5. But there's different things that we're doing within that industry that has cascaded. I think we've had 67% year-over-year growth in that particular portion of the business, but only a portion was attributed, from the work that we've done together with Anteriad.
This one might be for both of you. I'll let you dissect it. When describing your engine for repeatable success, you said every week our team looks at whether or not we're targeting the right audiences. Can you talk more specifically about what your team does to do this?
Yeah, we are devils in the detail and in the data. And we are looking at the data, every aspect of what that means. It is, I want to know when things are being sent. We want to know days, times, what message. We want to know the subject lines. So when we meet and talk about, we had a 20% click rate, or I'm sorry, we had a open rate, a 20% open rate, with a 2%, click rate. What does that mean? Can we get that, to 3%, from a click rate? If we do that, do we need to add more buttons or areas for people to click? So we're looking at the data, we're understanding what it's, telling us, and we have, dashboards that we're looking at things in real time on our end. So it's become more of I want to say a day-to-day as part of the journey, but it's something that we consistently, look at and measure.
And from an audience standpoint, we're always reassessing what's working and what isn't. We're still learning the timing across the year, because as much as Brent talked about their sales scaling across the year or moving up month to month to month, there are going to be some peaks, hopefully long-term, in the B2B business around timing of events in the spring and then again in the fall, some bigger buying seasons in the summer. We think we can move those needles. Now it's finding those audiences that can help do that. So we're taking some of the learnings from this week or this month, who's opening emails. They may have not bought yet. Those are probably going to be the people we're going to lean into more so that we start driving quotes and then driving dollars.
Yeah.
One more question I'd like to try to get in, and then I'm going to let everybody go. Can you talk a little bit more about how you measured incrementality? I'm interested in what the holdout audience was.
You want to take that one, Scott?
Sure. So this was really a big push from the RTIC folks when we started, was how do we identify an audience that we can keep consistent, that truly reflects our audience and reflects the greater program, and so that we can truly understand incrementality. And so we built an audience on the front end that was probably some of the best buyers, and we held out those sites, those companies, those domains, and excluded them from our campaign. And we tracked them throughout the entirety of the pilot. And Brent brought this up just the other day. We also evolved that holdout. We have some additional holdouts that we're tracking around some specific audiences to make sure that our incrementality is consistent as we continue to move the program forward. And so it gives us a great baseline to say, hey, we know some of these people are going to buy because we're doing things in other channels, because Brent is putting YouTube videos out there. Yeah. But this is really what this channel is doing.
That is all the time we have for today. I want to thank both of you for participating. I look forward to our next discussion, and thanks everybody for joining us today. Make it a good one. Thanks so much. Bye.
Likewise.
Thank you all.
Always a pleasure, Scott. Dee, thanks.
Thanks.